Ben was no stranger to hardship. Born and raised in the heart of a struggling urban neighborhood, he found solace and expression in art. As a young boy, he'd sit by the cracked window of their tiny apartment, sketching the world outside with a pencil his mother had bought at a dollar store. His first masterpiece was drawn on the back of a grocery receipt, an image of the city skyline, etched with the careful precision of a child who saw beauty in the mundane. Over the years, Ben's passion grew, but formal training was never an option. Art classes were a luxury, and his family barely had enough to cover the basics. He devoured art books from the public library and watched countless videos online, teaching himself techniques that others spent years learning in prestigious art schools. His works carried an authenticity that couldn't be taught, a raw, unfiltered emotion that came from living through struggle and hope. But the art world was unkind to dreamers like Ben. It was a place where connections, prestige, and pedigree seemed to matter more than talent. Galleries often favored established names or trendy styles, leaving no room for outsiders without a resume filled with accolades. Despite the countless rejections, Ben remained resolute. His art wasn't just a hobby, it was his voice. Ben's visit to the prestigious gallery. One cold morning, Ben stood outside Elite Expressions, a gallery renowned for its high-profile clientele and extravagant exhibits. Clutching a portfolio of his finest work, he took a deep breath. He had spent weeks preparing for this moment, meticulously curating pieces that showcased his range, from vivid depictions of urban life to hauntingly beautiful abstracts. The gallery was as intimidating as it was opulent. The walls were adorned with enormous, extravagant paintings, each bearing the signature of a well-known artist. The air smelled faintly of expensive perfume and polished wood. Ben couldn't help but feel out of place in his simple jeans and a worn-out jacket, but he reminded himself that his art would speak for itself. Mrs. Clara, the gallery owner, stood near the center of the room. She was a middle-aged woman with perfectly styled hair, a designer dress, and an air of authority that commanded attention. Known for her sharp tongue and exclusivity, Mrs. Clara was both respected and feared in the art world. Ben approached her cautiously, introducing himself and explaining his desire to have his work featured at the gallery. "I believe my art could resonate with your audience," he said, his voice steady despite his nerves. Mrs. Clara gave him a once-over, her expression a mixture of amusement and disdain. "Amateur artists don't belong in a place like this," she said, her tone laced with condescension. "You're better off trying one of those street fairs. This is a professional establishment." Ben's heart sank. "If you could just look at my portfolio," he urged, opening the folder to reveal his pieces. Each one told a story of resilience, community, and the human spirit. But Mrs. Clara didn't bother to glance at them. "I'm sorry," she said with a dismissive wave of her hand. "We don't have time for this. Try someplace less serious." Humiliated, Ben turned and walked out, clutching his portfolio tightly. The sting of rejection was familiar, but Mrs. Clara's words cut deeper than he expected. Still, as he stepped onto the busy street, he vowed to prove her wrong. The mockery and dismissal. That evening, Ben sat in his tiny apartment, staring at his paintings. The vibrant colors and intricate details that once filled him with pride now seemed overshadowed by doubt. He couldn't understand why people like Mrs. Clara refused to see his worth. Was it his lack of formal training? His background? Or something more insidious? He thought about giving up, packing away his brushes, and finding a real job, as some of his friends often suggested. But deep down, he knew he couldn't. Art was his lifeline, his way of making sense of the world. No amount of rejection could take that away from him. A spark of opportunity. The next day, Ben decided to take a walk to clear his mind. Carrying his portfolio out of habit, he wandered into a nearby park, where he often found inspiration. As he sat on a bench, flipping through his drawings, he felt a shadow fall over him. "Excuse me," said a deep voice. Ben looked up to see an older man in a tailored suit, his silver hair shining in the sunlight. The man's piercing blue eyes scanned Ben's portfolio with genuine interest. "Is this your work?" the man asked, gesturing to the sketches. Yes, Ben replied cautiously. I'm an artist. The man smiled. It's rare to find such raw talent these days. May I take a closer look? Ben hesitated but handed over the portfolio. The man flipped through the pages, nodding appreciatively at each piece. This is extraordinary, he said. You have a unique perspective, one that speaks to the soul. Thank you, Ben said, his voice tinged with surprise. It had been so long since anyone had praised his work. The man introduced himself as Mr. Harrison, a private collector and longtime patron of the arts. Unlike most collectors, Mr. Harrison preferred to remain behind the scenes, quietly supporting emerging talent. You've got something special, Ben, he said. But I'm guessing you've had a hard time breaking into the industry. Ben nodded. It's been tough. People like Mrs. Clara don't even give me a chance. Mr. Harrison's expression darkened at the mention of Mrs. Clara. She's part of the problem, he said. Too many gatekeepers in this industry are blinded by their own biases. But I believe in talent, not pedigree. He offered Ben a card. I want to help you navigate this world. It won't be easy, but if you're willing to work hard, I can introduce you to the right people. Ben stared at the card, his mind racing. He didn't know whether to trust this stranger, but something about Mr. Harrison's sincerity gave him hope. Why would you help me? He asked. Because I've been where you are, Mr. Harrison replied. I know what it's like to be overlooked. And because your art deserves to be seen. For the first time in weeks, Ben felt a glimmer of hope. He shook Mr. Harrison's hand, determined to seize this opportunity. Little did he know, this encounter would mark the beginning of a journey that would change his life forever. Mr. Harrison's guidance. Ben didn't know what to expect when he arrived at the address on Mr. Harrison's card, a sleek, modern building tucked away in an affluent part of the city. Inside, the walls were adorned with exquisite pieces of art from renowned artists, yet nothing about the space felt pretentious. The receptionist greeted him warmly and ushered him into a spacious office filled with natural light. Mr. Harrison stood by a large window, studying a painting on the wall. Welcome, Ben, he said with a smile. I'm glad you came. Over the next hour, Mr. Harrison outlined his plan to help Ben break into the art world. He explained the importance of not just creating exceptional art, but also building a narrative that resonated with audiences. People don't just buy art, Ben, he said. They buy stories, emotions, and connections. Your work already has that. We just need to amplify it. Mr. Harrison introduced Ben to influential figures in the art community, gallery owners, collectors, and curators who valued talent over status. These meetings were eye-opening for Ben, who had never imagined being in the same room as such prominent people. Yet, it wasn't easy. Many were skeptical of a self-taught artist from an underprivileged background, and Ben had to work twice as hard to prove himself. Under Mr. Harrison's mentorship, Ben refined his approach. He experimented with new techniques, blending his signature style with innovative ideas. His art became a powerful reflection of his journey, paintings that told stories of resilience, hope, and triumph over adversity. Each piece carried a raw, emotional weight that captivated everyone who saw it. But the road wasn't without challenges. Late nights turned into early mornings as Ben poured his heart and soul into his work. There were moments of self-doubt when he questioned whether he was good enough to make it. Yet, every time he faltered, Mr. Harrison was there to encourage him. Talent can get you noticed, but perseverance will get you remembered, Mr. Harrison often said. Those words became Ben's mantra as he continued to push forward. Ben's first break. After months of hard work, Mr. Harrison arranged for Ben to showcase his collection at a prestigious art exhibit. The event was a proving ground for emerging talent, attended by critics, collectors, and industry insiders. For Ben, it was a make-or-break moment. The night of the exhibit, Ben stood nervously by his display. His paintings were arranged in chronological order, each one a chapter in his story. The centerpiece was a large, breathtaking piece titled Roots and Wings, symbolizing his journey from humble beginnings to newfound hope. As the room filled with guests, Ben noticed a mix of reactions. Some stopped to admire his work, engaging in animated discussions about its depth and meaning. Others walked past without a second glance. But as the evening progressed, something remarkable happened. A small crowd began to gather around his display. One of the first to approach Ben was an art critic from a major publication. "Your work is extraordinary," she said, her eyes scanning the details of a painting. "It's raw, unfiltered, and deeply moving. I'd love to feature your story." Word spread quickly, and soon Ben found himself surrounded by collectors eager to purchase his pieces. By the end of the night, he had sold several paintings, earning more money in one evening than he had ever imagined. But more importantly, he had made a lasting impression on the art world. The success of the exhibit catapulted Ben into the spotlight. Articles and interviews highlighted his unique journey, and his art began to gain a loyal following. For the first time in his life, Ben felt validated, not just as an artist, but as a person. Climbing the ladder of success. As weeks turned into months, Ben's reputation continued to grow. His paintings were featured in galleries across the country, and collectors clamored to own his work. He became known for his ability to capture the human experience in a way that was both deeply personal and universally relatable. Financial stability followed, allowing Ben to move out of his cramped apartment into a modest but comfortable studio. He invested in better materials and even hired a small team to help manage his growing career. Yet, despite his newfound success, he remained grounded. Ben often thought about Mrs. Clara and her dismissive words. They no longer stung the way they once did, but they served as a reminder of how far he had come. He realized that success wasn't just about proving others wrong, it was about proving himself right. The invitation to success. One day, Ben received an invitation to a high-profile charity auction. The event, organized by a renowned gallery, would feature works from some of the biggest names in the industry. Ben was thrilled to learn that one of his paintings had been selected for the auction, a piece titled The Bridge, symbolizing unity and understanding. As Ben scanned the guest list, one name caught his eye, Mrs. Clara. She was listed as a featured guest, a representative of elite expressions. A mixture of emotions welled up in him: anticipation, curiosity, and a hint of satisfaction. He wondered if she would remember him and what she would think of his success. The night of the event, Ben arrived dressed in a tailored suit, looking every bit the part of a successful artist. The venue was breathtaking, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a stunning view of the city skyline. Inside, the atmosphere buzzed with excitement as guests mingled, sipping champagne and admiring the art on display. Ben's painting was prominently featured near the center of the room, drawing attention from attendees. As he moved through the crowd, he overheard snippets of conversation praising his work. It was a surreal experience, a far cry from the days when he struggled to even get noticed. When Mrs. Clara arrived, Ben watched from a distance as she made her rounds, greeting guests with her usual air of authority. She eventually stopped in front of his painting, her expression unreadable. Ben wondered if she recognized it as his work, but she seemed more focused on impressing the other guests with her knowledge of art. As the evening progressed, Ben found himself face to face with Mrs. Clara. She didn't recognize him at first, offering him a polite but disinterested smile. "Wonderful event, isn't it?" she said casually. "It is," Ben replied, his tone measured. "I'm glad you like the art." Mrs. Clara glanced at him, her brow furrowing slightly. "Are you one of the artists?" Ben smiled. "Yes. The painting in the center, The Bridge, is mine." Her eyes widened in surprise. "That's your work? It's extraordinary." "Thank you," Ben said, his voice calm but firm. "I remember coming to your gallery once, hoping to show you my portfolio." For a moment, Mrs. Clara looked confused. Then realization dawned on her face, followed by a flicker of embarrassment. "Oh," she said softly, avoiding his gaze. "I didn't realize." Ben didn't press the issue. Instead, he extended his hand. "It's nice to see you here." As Mrs. Clara shook his hand, Ben saw a mix of emotions in her eyes: regret, admiration, and perhaps a hint of respect. For him, the moment wasn't about revenge, it was about validation. He had risen through the shadows, and now, he stood in the light. The event's glamour. The charity auction was nothing short of a masterpiece in itself. Held in an iconic downtown venue known for hosting the city's most prestigious events, the hall radiated opulence. Massive chandeliers cast a warm glow over the marble floors, and the walls were adorned with a curated selection of artwork from renowned and rising artists alike. Guests in evening attire sipped champagne and exchanged pleasantries, their conversations punctuated by soft music from a live quartet. Ben arrived early, dressed in a tailored suit that exuded quiet confidence. As he stepped into the grand hall, he felt a mix of awe and pride. A year ago, this scene would have seemed like a distant dream. Now, he was a part of it, not as a spectator, but as a featured artist. His painting, The Bridge, was prominently displayed near the center of the room, commanding attention. The piece, with its sweeping strokes and vivid colors, depicted two figures reaching out to each other across a divide, symbolizing unity and understanding. Ben had poured his soul into the piece, and it showed. Guests paused to admire it, their faces reflecting the emotions it evoked. Ben moved through the crowd, exchanging polite smiles and engaging in brief conversations. He felt a sense of belonging he had never experienced before. Gone were the days of being overlooked or dismissed. Tonight, he stood shoulder to shoulder with the art world's elite. Mrs. Clara's reaction. Among the distinguished guests was Mrs. Clara, who arrived fashionably late, her entrance as calculated as her every move. She wore a stunning evening gown, her demeanor radiating authority and confidence. Her reputation as a gatekeeper in the art world preceded her, and many guests eagerly sought her attention. As she made her way through the hall, Mrs. Clara paused in front of Ben's painting. She tilted her head, studying the piece with an appraising eye. "Exquisite," she murmured to her companion, a fellow gallery owner. "This artist has remarkable depth. The composition, the emotion, it's simply captivating." Mrs. Clara's praise was genuine, but it was clear she had no idea who the artist was. To her, the painting was just another impressive addition to the evening's collection, its creator likely someone with the pedigree she had always valued. Ben watched the scene from a distance, a small smile playing on his lips. It was surreal to hear Mrs. Clara praising his work after the way she had dismissed him. But he didn't approach her, not yet. He wanted the evening to unfold naturally. The revelation. As the auction began, the room buzzed with anticipation. A polished auctioneer took the stage, his charismatic voice guiding the proceedings. Item after item was presented, each piece fetching impressive bids. When it was time for The Bridge, the atmosphere shifted. The room seemed to hold its breath as the painting was introduced. "This next piece," the auctioneer announced, "is titled The Bridge, created by a rising star in the art world. Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to introduce the artist himself, Ben." A spotlight illuminated Ben as he stood from his seat, his heart pounding. The room erupted in applause, and he felt a wave of emotion as he walked to the stage. Standing under the spotlight, he took a moment to scan the crowd, his gaze landing briefly on Mrs. Clara. Mrs. Clara's face was a portrait of shock. Her expression, typically composed, faltered as she realized who Ben was. The artist she had dismissed as an amateur now stood before her, celebrated and admired by the very people she sought to impress. Ben addressed the audience with humility and gratitude, sharing a brief story about the inspiration behind his painting. The bid started shortly after, and The Bridge sold for an astounding amount, with proceeds going to charity. It was a moment of triumph, not just for Ben but for everything his art represented. A subtle confrontation. After the auction, Ben mingled with guests, receiving congratulations and praise from collectors and critics. As he moved through the crowd, he found himself face to face with Mrs. Clara. She stood near the edge of the room, a glass of champagne in her hand and an unreadable expression on her face. Ben, she said, her voice careful. Your painting tonight was extraordinary. Thank you, Mrs. Clara, Ben replied, his tone even. I'm glad you enjoyed it. There was a pause as she searched for the right words. I must admit, I didn't realize. I didn't recognize you. It's been some time since you visited my gallery. Yes, it has, Ben said, meeting her gaze. I remember that day well. Mrs. Clara looked away, clearly uncomfortable. I hope you know it wasn't personal, she began, but Ben interrupted her gently. It wasn't personal to you, he said, his voice calm but firm. But it was to me. That day, I almost gave up on my dream. Your words made me question whether I belonged in this world. But I didn't stop, and tonight, I'm here. Mrs. Clara nodded slowly, her expression a mix of regret and admiration. You've proven yourself in a way few ever do. Your talent speaks for itself. Ben smiled faintly. Thank you, but it's not just about proving myself. It's about creating something that resonates with people, that tells a story worth hearing. Mrs. Clara hesitated before responding. I underestimated you, Ben. And for that, I apologize. I appreciate that, Ben said. But more than an apology, I hope you'll remember this the next time an artist walks into your gallery. Talent doesn't always come packaged the way we expect. Her eyes softened, and she nodded. I will. As Ben walked away, he felt a sense of closure. He didn't need Mrs. Clara's validation to feel successful, he had already found it within himself. But the exchange was a reminder of how far he had come, and how much further he could go. That night, as he left the venue, Ben reflected on his journey. The boy who had been dismissed as an amateur was now a rising star, not just in the art world but in his own eyes. The moment of truth had come and gone, and Ben had emerged victorious. Ben's growing influence. Ben's career soared like a phoenix rising from the ashes. His name became synonymous with authenticity, creativity, and resilience. No longer the struggling artist who fought for recognition, he was now a force to be reckoned with in the art world. His works were showcased in international galleries, sought after by prestigious collectors, and featured in magazines and documentaries. Yet, Ben remained grounded, never forgetting his roots or the people who had supported him along the way. Fueled by his experiences of rejection and prejudice, Ben decided to create a space that would serve as a sanctuary for underrepresented artists. He opened his own gallery, New Horizons, in the heart of the city. The name was a reflection of his vision, a future where art was celebrated for its merit, not the background or status of its creator. New Horizons quickly became a beacon of inclusivity. Ben personally scouted artists from diverse backgrounds, giving opportunities to those who, like him, had faced rejection due to biases and systemic barriers. Each exhibit told a story, weaving together different cultures, perspectives, and experiences. The gallery thrived, not just as a business, but as a movement. Collectors flocked to it, eager to support its mission and discover fresh talent. Ben's influence extended beyond the gallery walls. He hosted workshops, mentorship programs, and community events, ensuring that the next generation of artists had the tools and confidence to succeed. His rise wasn't just about personal success, it was about uplifting others and reshaping the art world. Mrs. Clara's decline. While Ben's star rose, Mrs. Clara found herself struggling to keep up. For years, her gallery, Elite Expressions, had been a cornerstone of the art world's elite circles. But times were changing. Collectors were no longer content with outdated notions of prestige and exclusivity. They sought meaningful connections and authentic art, qualities that Clara's gallery lacked. Her refusal to adapt became her downfall. Talented artists turned elsewhere, drawn to galleries like New Horizons that celebrated diversity and innovation. Mrs. Clara's exhibits, once the pinnacle of sophistication, now felt stale and out of touch. Attendance dwindled, sales plummeted, and critics began to question whether her gallery had lost its relevance. Desperate to reclaim her former glory, Mrs. Clara tried to emulate the success of New Horizons. She organized events with themes of inclusivity but failed to capture the genuine spirit behind the movement. Her efforts came across as performative, and the art world wasn't fooled. As her reputation faltered, so did her connections. Collectors who once sang her praises now distanced themselves, seeking fresher, more dynamic galleries. For the first time in her career, Mrs. Clara felt the sting of rejection. An unexpected visit. On a rainy afternoon, Ben was in his gallery, preparing for an upcoming exhibit featuring a young, self-taught sculptor whose work embodied themes of resilience. The gallery was bustling with activity, artists setting up displays, staff coordinating logistics, and visitors admiring the current collection. Amid the vibrant chaos, Ben noticed a familiar figure standing hesitantly by the entrance. Mrs. Clara. Her once commanding presence seemed diminished. Dressed impeccably as always, she clutched a leather handbag tightly, her expression a mix of determination and vulnerability. Ben approached her, his face neutral. "Mrs. Clara," he greeted, extending a hand. "What brings you to New Horizons?" She hesitated before shaking his hand. "Ben," she began, her voice measured. I wanted to speak with you." "May I?" Ben led her to a quiet corner of the gallery where they could talk privately. She glanced around, taking in the vibrant atmosphere and the diverse array of artwork on display. "Your gallery is remarkable," she admitted. "It's everything the art world should be." "Thank you," Ben replied. "But I suspect you didn't come here just to compliment me." Mrs. Clara sighed, her polished demeanor cracking slightly. "I need your help, Ben. My gallery is struggling. Collectors, artists, even critics, they've all moved on. I don't understand what I'm doing wrong." Ben leaned back in his chair, studying her. "What you're doing wrong, Mrs. Clara, is holding on to an outdated mindset. The art world has changed. People want authenticity, diversity, and connection. They're tired of elitism." She looked down, her hands clasped tightly. "I've realized that. But it's difficult to change after so many years." "It is," Ben agreed. "But if you're here, it means you're willing to try." "A proposal for redemption." Mrs. Clara hesitated before speaking. "Ben, your gallery has become a symbol of everything I've failed to embrace. I need to turn things around, and I believe you can help me. Perhaps we could collaborate?" Ben didn't answer immediately. He wanted to ensure her intentions were genuine. "If we collaborate, Mrs. Clara, it can't just be a business decision. You'll need to fully commit to embracing inclusivity and supporting underrepresented artists. No half measures, no performative gestures. Real change." She nodded, her expression serious. "I'm willing to learn. To do whatever it takes." "Good," Ben said. "We'll start with a joint exhibit, artists from both our galleries. But it won't be about competition. It'll be about collaboration and shared growth." Mrs. Clara looked both relieved and apprehensive. "Thank you, Ben. I won't let you down." Over the following weeks, the two worked together to plan the exhibit. Mrs. Clara attended workshops and meetings with artists, immersing herself in their stories and perspectives. She began to see the world, and the art within it, through a new lens. It was a humbling experience, but one she embraced wholeheartedly. The joint exhibit, titled Bridging Perspectives, was a massive success. It featured works that celebrated diversity, resilience, and connection. Critics hailed it as a turning point in the art world, praising both Ben and Mrs. Clara for their collaboration. For Mrs. Clara, it marked the beginning of a transformation, not just of her gallery but of her values. Ben watched as Mrs. Clara interacted with the artists, her once dismissive demeanor replaced by genuine curiosity and respect. He realized that while her journey had been different from his, it was no less important. Together, they had turned the tables, creating a legacy that would inspire future generations. A new partnership. The buzz around Bridging Perspectives was nothing short of revolutionary. For weeks leading up to the event, the art world was abuzz with anticipation. Critics, collectors, and artists alike marveled at the collaboration between Ben, the symbol of inclusivity and modernity, and Mrs. Clara, a figure once associated with elitism. The joint exhibit promised to be more than just a showcase of art, it was a statement. On the day of the exhibit, the venue, a sprawling gallery space that Ben had redesigned with warmth and accessibility in mind, was packed with guests. The collection on display was nothing short of breathtaking, featuring works from artists of all backgrounds, each piece telling a unique story. From vibrant paintings that celebrated cultural heritage to abstract sculptures that spoke of resilience, the exhibit was a celebration of diversity. Ben and Mrs. Clara stood side by side during the opening address. Ben, ever humble, focused on the artists and their incredible talents. Mrs. Clara, visibly more grounded than ever, spoke candidly about her journey. For years, she began, her voice steady but tinged with emotion, I believed that prestige was the most valuable currency in the art world. I was wrong. Talent, passion, and authenticity are what truly matter. Working with Ben has opened my eyes, and for that, I'm profoundly grateful. The applause that followed was thunderous. The event was a massive success, with every piece in the collection either sold or reserved by the end of the night. More importantly, it reshaped perceptions in the art world, proving that collaboration and inclusivity were not just trends, they were the future. Mrs. Clara's growth. In the months following the exhibit, Mrs. Clara underwent a personal and professional transformation. She immersed herself in the world of underrepresented artists, attending their workshops, learning about their journeys, and understanding their struggles. Her once rigid demeanor softened as she began to see the beauty in perspectives she had previously overlooked. One of her most significant steps was publicly acknowledging her past mistakes. In an interview with a prominent art magazine, she reflected on her journey. I owe my transformation to Ben, she said. His resilience and vision forced me to confront my own biases. The art world isn't just about what hangs on the walls, it's about the stories, the people, and the emotions behind it. I've learned that true growth comes from listening and adapting. Mrs. Clara's advocacy for underrepresented artists became a cornerstone of her work. She started hosting free mentorship programs at her gallery, inviting young, self-taught artists to learn and grow. The space that was once a fortress of exclusivity became a hub of creativity and collaboration. Ben's triumph. While Mrs. Clara embraced her journey of growth, Ben's influence continued to expand. New Horizons became more than just a gallery, it became a cultural movement. Artists from across the globe sought out Ben's mentorship, drawn not only by his success, but by his genuine desire to uplift others. Ben's gallery hosted exhibitions that challenged societal norms, celebrating themes of unity, resilience, and progress. He collaborated with schools and community centers to bring art programs to underserved areas, ensuring that the next generation of artists had the resources he once lacked. But his impact wasn't limited to the art world. Ben's story inspired countless individuals across industries to persevere despite adversity. He became a sought-after speaker, sharing his journey at universities, conferences, and events. Through it all, he remained true to himself, always focusing on the power of storytelling and connection. New Horizons expanded to include a foundation that provided grants to emerging artists, ensuring that talent and passion were never stifled by financial barriers. Ben's vision wasn't just about creating art, it was about creating opportunities. Full circle. Years later, on a quiet evening, Ben stood in the heart of his gallery, now a vibrant institution revered worldwide. The walls were adorned with pieces from artists he had mentored, each one a testament to the power of perseverance and belief. The hum of voices filled the space as visitors admired the collection, but Ben's focus was elsewhere. He gazed at a familiar painting hanging in the center of the gallery, the bridge. It had become more than just a symbol of his success, it was a reminder of the journey that had brought him here. From a struggling artist dismissed as an amateur to a leader who had redefined the art world, Ben's life had come full circle. Behind him, a group of young artists stood, discussing their work with enthusiasm. Ben smiled, recognizing the same spark in their eyes that had once driven him. He joined them, offering encouragement and advice, his presence a source of inspiration. As the evening drew to a close, Ben walked to the gallery's entrance and looked out at the city lights. His heart swelled with pride, not just for what he had achieved, but for the lives he had touched and the legacy he had built. In that moment, he reflected on the words of his mentor, Mr. Harrison: "Talent can get you noticed, but perseverance will get you remembered." Ben had not only been noticed, he had created a legacy that would endure, lighting the way for generations to come. The story of Ben, the artist who refused to give up, was no longer just his own. It was the story of every dreamer who dared to believe in their worth, every underdog who refused to be silenced, and every voice that found strength in their struggles. It was a story of redemption, growth, and triumph, a story that would continue to inspire long after the final brushstroke.